Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into powdered wigs, gold-plated family trees, and jaws that could deflect cannonballs. Welcome to the twisted world of the Habsburgs, a dynasty so powerful they ruled half of Europe, and so inbred they couldn't always chew soup. Born into royalty. Amazing. Just don't mind the fact that your bride is also your cousin, your chin is threatening to escape your face, and your family tree is more of a cursed pretzel. So dim the lights, settle in, and maybe put your jaw in a sling, because we're about to explore the gloriously grotesque rise and fall of the Habsburg Empire. And in the comments, tell me, would you rather rule an empire or be able to eat an apple without dislocating your face? Chapter 1. Welcome to the House of Habsburg. Please don't look too closely. Congratulations, you're a Habsburg, which means you've basically spawned from the political version of a nuclear reactor, glowing with power, but absolutely unstable under close inspection. You're not born, you're debuted, announced, possibly painted before you've even finished growing a nose. From the moment you emerge into this candlelit world, you're wrapped in silk, kissed by bishops, and immediately betrothed to a cousin you won't meet for another 12 years. What a life. But let's start with your inheritance, because being a Habsburg isn't just about prestige, it's about real estate. You own more of Europe than most modern train networks cover. Picture it. Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, Spain, Naples, Milan, the Netherlands, a slice of Burgundy, and, oh yes, a healthy portion of the New World. You know you're doing well when your family can divide entire continents like slices of roast duck. If Europe had a Zillow, your family would break the algorithm. Palaces in every time zone, castles perched on cliff faces, fortresses stuffed with silverware that hasn't been touched since Charlemagne lost his first tooth. Your summer home is bigger than some principalities. And don't forget the art. If a guy in a doublet ever painted it, odds are you own it. Somewhere in your labyrinthine properties there's a Titian or two just being used as a decorative fire screen. But wealth and land aren't the only things you inherit. You also get titles. So many titles. You are not just Duke of this and Count of that. You're the Archduke of here, the hereditary Lord of there, the Elector of possibly everywhere. Your full title takes longer to recite than it does to conquer Luxembourg. In formal documents, your name gets its own paragraph. It ends with etc., because even the scribes give up halfway through. And prestige, that's baked into your bloodline like lead into a Roman pipe. Courtiers bow at your toenails. Lesser royals name their children after you. Even your slippers have a higher rank than the average merchant. You could cough in public and someone would declare it holy. And when you sneeze, that's a minor holiday in at least 3 provinces. But before you start feeling too smug, take a closer look in the mirror. Go on, tilt your head, try smiling. That's not great, is it? Because you're not just a Habsburg in name. You're a Habsburg in bone structure, and unfortunately, your family has been recycling the same jawline for the last 3 centuries. Your face isn't so much sculpted as engineered by committee, and none of the committee members had access to a medical textbook. That lower mandible? It juts, it protrudes. It might have its own postal code. When you eat soup, it splashes sideways. When you try to whistle, birds think you're dying. And yet, you are the elite. You walk down palace corridors with 12 servants and 17 titles trailing behind you. You host masked balls in mirrored halls that make Versailles look like a particularly ambitious barn. Your life is scented with rose oil and riddled with obligation. You are expected to rule, to marry, to produce heirs, and to pretend that your cousin wife's sideburns don't bother you. You're a portrait in progress, a political chess piece, and a walking medical case study. and it's only Monday. Welcome to the House of Habsburg. Please don't look too closely at the chin. Portraits, propaganda, and peculiarly shaped skulls. Let's talk portraits. Because when you're a Habsburg, your entire existence is public relations with a crown on top. You don't just rule, you pose, extensively. Oil paint becomes your legacy, and your face is your brand. Unfortunately, your brand looks like someone pressed a loaf of bread into a metal gate and called it royalty. Early Habsburg portraits are subtle, regal, austere. Then, over the centuries, something begins to change. Subtly at first. The chins get longer, the lower lips get thicker, the eyes start drifting apart like they're plotting separate coups. What began as noble dignity ends up looking like a family-wide allergic reaction to gene diversity. And yet, these portraits were meant to inspire awe, not whispers. That 14-foot canvas of your great-grandfather standing in golden armor. It's not just wall decoration, it's state propaganda. A reminder to every visiting ambassador and terrified subject that this face, this remarkably unfortunate face, represents divine right and inherited supremacy. But the painters, oh, the poor painters, they had a choice: capture reality and be dismissed, or beautify the family jaw and risk causing confusion at the next formal banquet. Because when your real-life chin can't fit on the canvas without a second easel, artistic discretion becomes a diplomatic crisis. Some artists tried to disguise it: soft lighting, careful angles, heroic squints. Others leaned in, giving your great-uncle a mandible so massive it looked like he could bench press the Bible. This wasn't just vanity, it was dynastic branding. Portraits were diplomatic tools. You'd send one to a foreign court to convince someone to marry you. Imagine being a teenage duchess in Bavaria, opening a gilded scroll, and seeing a painted suitor with the facial symmetry of a melted gargoyle. And still being told, say yes. He owns the Netherlands. Of course, portraits were only the beginning. Public appearances reinforced the brand. You were expected to exude stability, health, and holy authority, while your jaw actively undermined every syllable. You gave speeches with a lisp. You smiled like a broken accordion. You took part in festivals, hunts, and ceremonies while secretly hoping no one noticed your left eye blinking half a second behind the right. And let's not forget the ceremonial armor, designed more for intimidating peasants than for comfort. Your helmet never quite fits, thanks to the noble bulge in your skull. Your breastplate is polished until it reflects your own uncomfortable grimace. And still, you wave, because you are a symbol, a slightly slanted, medically perplexing symbol. Behind the scenes, of course, there's anxiety, everyone knows. Courtiers snicker behind fans. Artists groan when handed another commission. Foreign dignitaries make polite noises when meeting you, but the moment they return home, your likeness becomes the punchline of 5 new dinner party anecdotes. And still, the illusion must be maintained. Because to question your appearance is to question the dynasty. To doubt your health is to doubt your right to rule. So the Habsburgs doubled down. Bigger portraits, bigger titles, bigger weddings, and, unfortunately, bigger jaws. By now, your family's facial structure isn't just a minor medical curiosity, it's a diplomatic liability and an inescapable meme. But here's the kicker. For all the discomfort, the awkward social encounters, and the warped oil paintings, it worked. You stayed in power. You kept the crown. You ruled an empire. Because as long as the portrait said power, it didn't matter if the subject couldn't physically chew his own lunch. Nobility, neuroses, and the curse of the brocade onesie. You're a child of empire, which means your clothes weigh more than your problems, and your problems are significant. As a young Habsburg, You don't wear clothes, you wear statements, layers of them, heavily embroidered, jewel-encrusted, stiff as a political alliance and twice as uncomfortable. You've got lace at the throat, buttons at every joint, and a ceremonial hat that makes you look like a cupcake designed by someone going through a personal crisis. This is your daily uniform, not for battle, for breakfast. Your nursemaids lace you into velvet outfits while muttering about your noble posture, which is code for try not to droop like your cousin Leopold did before his spine collapsed at 17. You're propped, powdered, perfumed, and paraded down palace halls before you've finished teething. And yes, the teething is difficult, your jaws already doing geometry that makes dentists weep. You sit stiffly in a gilded chair that hasn't been comfortable since the Gothic era, eating gruel from a golden spoon while your tutor lectures you about Latin verb conjugations and how best to sign a treaty without twitching. You're 6 years old, dressed like a retiring pope, and the only game you're allowed to play is Don't Embarrass the Dynasty. Psychologically, this begins to take a toll, because while your body is being wrapped in silk, your mind is wrapped in expectations so tight they squeak. You must be dignified, stoic, the walking embodiment of imperial confidence. Never mind that you're terrified of birds and don't know what a friend is. Emotions are for peasants and artists. You, child monarch in training, must be calm, calculated, and ready to shake hands with a man who owns half of Italy and smells like dried eels. Family dinners don't help. You're surrounded by relatives who are also cousins, uncles who are also brothers-in-law, and great-aunts who might actually be your nieces depending on which line of descent you're counting. Conversation is a minefield. If you talk too much, you're impertinent. Too little, and you're sulking like Uncle Carl before he invaded something. And if you cough too loudly, someone might call for a bishop. The pressure is relentless. You are not a person. You are dynasty-shaped clay, and every adult in the palace has their hands on you. You are expected to understand statecraft before you understand fractions. You're learning 5 languages and being taught how to carry a ceremonial sword without tripping. You must smile for visiting dignitaries while enduring leg cramps from kneeling for 20 minutes during yet another family portrait commission. Meanwhile, the court physician keeps an eye on your face. He's watching that jaw, measuring it, making notes, occasionally muttering things like, symmetrical, but aggressively forward. You're told not to worry, but someone has already drawn up a potential bride list, and half the girls on it are statistically identical to you. At night, when the candles are out and the weight of courtly silence finally lifts, you lie awake, staring at the canopy above your bed. Stitched with gold, depicting your family lineage in a pattern so dense it may contain military secrets. You trace it with your eyes. Austria, Spain, Burgundy, Naples, and now, you. The next node, the next marriage, the next name written in Latin on a piece of parchment that will determine who your children will marry long before they're born. And in the quiet of your brocade blanket, one thought repeats, why does my jaw click when I breathe? Destiny by design, and you don't get to choose the blueprint. You were born to rule. Not because you're especially clever or inspiring or good at ruling. No, it's because a long line of ancestors signed treaties in blood and ink, ensuring your life path was decided before you even had a name. You are, effectively, a historical inevitability with a birth certificate. From the moment you take your first unsteady steps across an imported carpet, your future has been written in triplicate. You will not choose your education, your religion, your spouse, your wardrobe, or the hairstyle you wear in your commemorative coin engraving. You are the culmination of empire by committee, a meat puppet dressed in silk and embroidered with Latin expectations. But let's be clear, the adults around you aren't malicious. They don't hate you, they just don't see you. To them, you are a continuity project, a walking alliance. Your health is a matter of national security. Your tutor has a direct line to the Archbishop. Your nursemaid reports to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and your nanny just finished stitching an emergency baptismal gown just in case you hiccup again during dinner. Your opinions don't matter. If you cry too often, you're weak. If you don't cry at all, you're soulless. If you question why your governess only speaks in formal epithets and refers to you as your lineage, she'll remind you that your great-grandfather once declared war over a slightly crooked tapestry, so perhaps best not to challenge precedent. Eventually, the subject of marriage comes up. You're 12. Your suitor is 13. She's also your second cousin, or maybe first. It's hard to say. The family tree looks like a diagram from a wine-stained conspiracy theorist. There are arrows pointing to the same names multiple times, and at least 2 portraits of the same man labeled both father and nephew. The match is announced at dinner. You're chewing roasted goose. You nod solemnly because that's what Habsburgs do when they find out their teenage future includes potential syphilis and a dowry made of naval blockades. As you age, you begin to understand the machinery behind your gilded cage. Every decision has already been made. Your name will be passed to the priests, the generals, the midwives, and the treasury, and each of them will use it like a brand. Your signature will appear on laws you didn't write, your face on coins you didn't approve, your health discussed in coded language in letters between ministers. Our young Archduke is constitutionally fragile, which is palace speak for his jaw makes a noise like wet rope being twisted. And yet you smile, you bow, you ride the ceremonial horse, because you are expected to act as if this is a dream, a divine appointment, a royal fate handed down by God, or at least by a few popes who were already related to you. It's hard to explain to outsiders just how claustrophobic destiny feels when it's wrapped in velvet. You are pampered, protected, praised, but you are not free. Your whole life is a performance of someone else's script, written in a language no one speaks anymore, and carved into marble before your birth certificate was dry. And what happens if you try to change course? To say no, to resist the machinery, simple, you're replaced. Another cousin, another nephew, another forged document, signed by someone with a similar name and the same unfortunate cheekbones. The empire doesn't stop for feelings, so you keep marching because that's what Habsburgs do. Chapter 2. A Family Tree or a Bonsai Circle. The Inbreeding Instruction Manual, Deluxe Imperial Edition. So, you've decided to protect your empire. Good thinking. You've amassed power, wealth, and an alarming collection of ceremonial swords. There's just one small detail left: how to keep it all in the family. And by in the family, the Habsburgs mean literally. Cousins, nieces, uncles, you name it, someone's married it. Let's make one thing abundantly clear. The Habsburgs didn't just marry for love. They married like they were drafting a legal contract written in Latin, anxiety, and shared DNA. You don't choose your partner based on charm or compatibility. You choose them based on who owns Belgium and how many grandparents you share without hitting 4. The logic was simple. If your cousin is also heir to a throne, why waste all that sweet, sweet dynastic capital on a stranger? Outsourcing your bloodline is for amateurs. You, dear Archduke or Duchess, are expected to double down. Your romantic life is essentially a real-time board game, except the stakes are global politics, and your children might be born with 6 molars and a title. It all sounds like a grand plan. Consolidate power, eliminate foreign influence, Ensure your children have fewer kingdoms to fight over. But this isn't just marriage. It's incest with a crown. Royal inbreeding wasn't an accident. It was policy. It was a lifestyle. It was the Habsburg brand. You might not know algebra, but you absolutely know how to calculate a political marriage contract that also doubles as a family reunion. And it wasn't subtle. You didn't just marry one cousin, you married across cousins, repeatedly. Like a family picnic gone aggressively strategic. In fact, your family tree is more like a family wreath, beautifully circular and increasingly weird. There are entire generations where everyone shares at least one grandmother, sometimes two, occasionally the same one twice. You've got marriages between uncles and nieces, first cousins, double cousins, and whatever happens when the branches stop splitting and just merge. One 18th century genealogist reportedly gave up entirely trying to chart the Spanish line of Habsburgs and instead submitted a diagram shaped like a Mobius strip with teeth. It was accurate, disturbingly so, and this is where it starts to get visible. The same facial features reappear with uncanny persistence, the same deep-set eyes, the same aquiline nose, and of course the iconic Habsburg jaw, a mandible so legendary it should have had its own separate succession plan. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before the symptoms show up, the system needs to be understood. This is not just a family. This is an empire held together by DNA, desperate hope, and a shocking tolerance for awkward wedding toasts. Want your kids to inherit Spain and Naples? Marry your sister-in-law's daughter who is also your cousin. Want to keep Burgundy from falling into French hands? Great. Marry your uncle's niece's daughter. Confused? That's fine. So are half the priests officiating these ceremonies, and 3 of them just fainted from trying to memorize who isn't already related. These weren't casual unions either. These were planned years in advance. Toddlers were pledged to toddlers. Infants had engagement parties. Babies were dressed in wedding gowns and presented to other babies on cushions like extremely confused veal. And all of it was considered normal. No, responsible. This wasn't madness, this was statecraft. And if you had to sacrifice a few genetic variables along the way, well, what's a little drooling among monarchs? Wedding bells and genetic warning alarms. So, you're finally old enough to wed, which in Habsburg terms means you can sit upright without fainting, and have memorized your Latin prayer responses. Time to do your duty and marry someone with a similar blood type and an identical family crest. You might be thinking, surely we've learned by now. But no, this isn't learning, this is dynastic recursion. Your wedding isn't about love. It's not even about companionship. It's a border agreement in silk stockings. This is an occasion where 2 branches of the same family, which were already twisted around each other like anxious vines, finally reconnect in a ceremonial loop. It's less of a wedding and more of a family reunion with suspicious vows and political side quests. Now, the court festivities are stunning. There are tapestries the size of barns, enough roasted swans to make ornithologists weep, and dancing that's choreographed more tightly than your family tree. Everyone's smiling, except you. Because your bride is technically your cousin, looks alarmingly like your great-aunt, and has inherited that very specific Habsburg eyebrow situation. You're both teenagers. You've never had a private conversation. And now you're legally required to produce heirs with someone whose laugh triggers your genetic survival instincts. The ceremony is performed by a bishop who is also probably related to both of you. He reads vows in Latin while eyeing the guest list like it's a diagram of how not to shuffle a gene pool. Trumpets blare. Doves are released. One of them immediately flies into a tapestry, possibly sensing the vibe. Later, in your wedding bed, an enormous gilded four-poster that's seen more dynasty planning than an entire war council, you lie there wondering, is it treason to request a divorce based on facial symmetry? But of course, you don't. You fulfill your duty because the empire demands it, and also because your aunt, who is also your new grandmother-in-law, is watching from the hallway like a hawk in pearls. And here's the tragedy. You mean well, both of you. You make polite conversation over breakfast. You nod at each other during court processions. You try in the way two people try when they're caught in a genetic echo chamber, and constantly reminded that their children might come out with the knees of a chair. But try as you might, things get complicated. Fertility struggles, blamed on divine wrath, of course, miscarriages, whispers of curses, or worse, French interference. A child born with a lopsided skull? Well, clearly that's due to excessive exposure to the Protestant wind. Never mind the 8 shared great-grandparents. We don't talk about that. Meanwhile, your doctors begin to murmur. Quietly, in Latin, they examine your jawline and your heir's gait and start muttering words like morphology and recessive traits. But it's too late now. The bloodlines are already written in marble. Your lineage is locked, and the marriage must stand. Because no one dares say the truth aloud, this isn't just poor matchmaking. This is controlled collapse, dressed in ermine and performed to the sound of pipe organs. And you're not the first. You won't be the last. You are a link in a very shiny, very cursed genetic chain. Love in a time of limited gene? Pools. Love? Oh no, that's not your department. You're a Habsburg, and romantic compatibility was never in the job description. In fact, if you so much as develop feelings for someone not on the approved list of strategically acceptable relatives, you're swiftly redirected to more suitable options, like your cousin, or your niece, or your cousin's niece who is also your goddaughter and possibly your half-sister depending on how Charles V's second marriage is counted. You see, love in your dynasty isn't a warm spark between two souls. It's a legal maneuver with cake. Your marriage contract is 10 pages long, signed by 12 nobles, and notarized with a seal that looks like it weighs more than your fiancé. The dowry includes castles, titles, trade rights, and if you're lucky, a functioning gene. But hearts, even royal ones, have opinions, and that's where things get messy. Every so often, a young Habsburg develops a crush. Maybe it's a visiting minor noble. Maybe it's a stable hand with particularly good cheekbones. Maybe it's someone who, gasp, isn't related to you. Your tutors notice. Your priest notices. The whole court notices. And suddenly, you're sent away to reflect on your impure distractions in a monastery filled with incense, Latin scolding, and 5 other cousins who also had inappropriate thoughts last spring. Because the moment you suggest love might be important, you've committed treason against dynastic strategy. The family motto might as well be, marry whom we say, love in silence, and keep the jawline consistent. So, you learn to recalibrate. You start finding ways to feel fond of the person you're assigned. You rehearse lines. You praise their embroidery. You compliment their bone structure, which is also yours. You pretend that holding hands doesn't feel like shaking your own. Over time, affection grows, not in a warm, passionate fire kind of way, but more like mold in a shaded stone cellar. Inevitable, fuzzy, and mildly concerning, and the court applauds your maturity. But deep down, somewhere in the part of you that hasn't been completely replaced with protocol and powdered wigs, there's a gnawing realization. This is as good as it gets. Your romantic legacy is not a tale of sweeping love stories or forbidden passion. It's a slow-motion arrangement wrapped in Latin and punctuated by birth defects. Your children, the inevitable products of your strategic union, are born with noble titles and, if all goes to plan, enough inherited land to make any cartographer cry. But you also start to notice the quirks. Maybe one doesn't speak clearly. Maybe another can't hold a spoon without trembling. Maybe a third just stares into the corner for hours and bites anyone who brings up music. The court doctors mutter, "Ah, yes, the usual constitution." And someone lights another candle for St. Apollonia. Love in a time of limited gene pools is complicated. It's rehearsed, it's risk-managed, it's written into the architecture of your empire. But it's not warm, it's not free, it's obligated affection in a house where everyone shares the same great-grandfather and half of the dental anomalies in Western Europe. Still, you smile, you toast. You raise your goblet to eternal union, all while knowing that somewhere, another cousin is being groomed for a similarly tactical love story that will make your grandchildren resemble a genealogical funhouse mirror. The family tree has collapsed, and it's your fault, technically everyone's fault. It's not a family tree anymore, it's a hereditary disaster zone. By the 17th century, the Habsburg lineage has looped in on itself more times than a Baroque fugue. You're seeing the same 5 names recycled in every generation, like you're rebooting a franchise with steadily declining results. The consequences are undeniable. Medical journals begin to take an interest, not in your diplomacy, but in your jaw. Doctors dissect your relatives and gasp at the mess. The Habsburg chin isn't just a feature now, it's a diagnostic category. Charles II of Spain becomes the poster child for why you don't let your ancestors marry in a circle. He's barely functional, can't chew properly, and spends most of his reign surrounded by priests, mystics, and desperate political handlers praying he doesn't die mid-sentence. His autopsy reads like a horror novel. His portraits look like cries for help in oil paint. By now, the empire is splitting apart. Too many claims. Too few healthy heirs. Too many wars started over whose chin points slightly less southeast. France is circling. The Ottomans are amused. The Holy Roman Empire is starting to look more holy in the full of holes sense. And you're expected to fix it, to marry again, to produce another heir, to try, somehow, to uncollapse a bloodline that's now mostly just decorative. You know the end is coming, but you still go through the motions, because that's what Habsburgs do. You rule, you marry, you lisp your way through a Latin Mass, and you pass the burden to the next in line, who already has their engagement arranged with their second cousin. Twice removed, but only legally. Chapter 3. Strategic Matrimony, Tactical Malformations. The royal wedding that was a blood pact. Ah, yes, another wedding. You're 12. Your bride is 13. And the wedding planner is also your uncle, and also your bride's cousin. It's not just a family affair, it's a genetic déjà vu with cake. The marriage is less about celebration and more about territorial consolidation with floral arrangements. As you stand beneath the vaulted cathedral ceiling in an outfit that weighs more than your dignity, the archbishop drones through your 15 overlapping titles. The crowd murmurs. Not out of joy, but because they're trying to figure out whether this couple is fourth cousins or second cousins once removed. The answer is yes. Every eye in the room is on you, or, more accurately, on your jaw. A jawline so aggressively forward that the bridal veil had to be adjusted to avoid snagging on it. You try to smile. You look like someone stapled a melon to a plow. And still, the wedding is a triumph. You now control Naples, or at least half of it. The other half belongs to your new brother-in-law, who is also your nephew. The Habsburg chessboard gains another piece. Somewhere, a mapmaker groans and adds 3 hyphens to a title. But the guests know the real victory isn't geographic, it's symbolic. You've reinforced the illusion of unity, of permanence, of strength. And all it cost was another child bride, some incense, and the lingering risk of mandibular collapse by age 30. The Jawbone Empire strikes back. As the decades go on, the family traits deepen. You start noticing it in the portraits, the slow progression from handsome-ish to haunted cryptid. The chin becomes a geographic feature, the lips droop, the mouth can't quite close. Children of these strategic marriages begin to resemble Renaissance caricatures. Speech becomes slurred. Teeth grow in directions not covered by dental science. One heir has a tongue too large for his mouth. Another has nostrils that whistle during court proclamations. And the advisors pretend it's all fine, that Charles the Wheezing is perfectly fit to rule, that Maria the Wincing can ride a horse without screaming. No one dares suggest that perhaps, just maybe, it's time to marry someone with a different set of grandparents. Doctors begin to document it, though they speak in euphemisms. The Archduke suffers from noble fatigue. The princess has inherited the pious complexion. What they mean is, she looks like she lost a wrestling match with her own chromosomes. But the empire must continue, the jaw must rule. When your bloodline files a lawsuit against nature, it's not just about marriage anymore, it's about stubbornness, the belief that divine right means you can bend reality around your pedigree. And so the dynasty doubles down. You need heirs, heirs need spouses, and everyone available is already in the family portrait. So you marry again, to a niece, or a double cousin. You produce children who are described by court physicians as delicate. One is born without the ability to blink. Another cannot stand in direct sunlight. A third speaks only in a strange, haunting warble. By now, the family tree has collapsed into a dense, screaming bush. Every branch folds back into itself. The concept of genetic variation has been replaced with whatever the jaw decides today. The people begin to murmur. Superstition festers. You hear stories of peasants claiming the royal baby has goat eyes, or that he floated briefly above the font during his christening. You laugh it off. But deep down, part of you wonders if maybe God has stopped blessing your bloodline and started trolling it. Portraits of power and the shape of decline. Years later, you examine a gallery of your ancestors. The frescoes, the oil paintings, the etchings, they all share one trait, defiance. Not just political or religious, biological defiance. These are people who looked at Mendelian inheritance and said, "Not today." And yet the dynasty endured, because in this world appearance didn't matter until it did, when the jawline became a metaphor for everything: excess, hubris, the refusal to adapt. What once symbolized unity now whispered of rot. As your own portrait is painted, one eye drooping, one tooth visibly escaping, you understand. This isn't just your face, it's your family's thesis statement. A century of marriages with the same 10 surnames. A love letter to territory written in slurred vowels and overextended mandibles. You ruled with strategy. You married with precision. And now you must chew with caution. Welcome to the golden age of tactical malformations. Chapter 4. You get Spain, I get Austria. We both get syphilis. How to divide an empire, poorly and with nepotism. One day, in 1556, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Lord of the Netherlands, owner of 2 chins and a very tired soul, decides he's had enough. Maybe it was the gout. Maybe it was the Reformation. Maybe it was the fact that every time he looked at his family, he saw progressively more haunted versions of himself. Either way, he abdicates and splits the Habsburg Empire into two deliciously cursed halves. Spain and its global loot goes to his son, Philip II, a man who treats Catholicism like a sport and whose eyebrows never quite learned how to relax. Austria and the Holy Roman Empire go to Charles's brother, Ferdinand, slightly more chill, marginally more Protestant tolerant, but still 100% committed to keeping the family bloodline folded like an origami disaster. It's like the world's most intense estate division. You take the sun-kissed colonies, I'll take the spiky bits with the angry Protestants. The split is strategic, sure. It makes administration easier, reduces internal rivalries, and creates two power centers that can, theoretically, support each other. In practice, it creates two parallel Habsburg tracks for inbreeding, bad decisions, and decorative facial swelling. The Spanish line becomes the more aggressively Catholic branch, marrying cousins with the zeal of someone playing theological bingo. Meanwhile, the Austrian line prefers elaborate court rituals, melancholic poetry, and marrying their nieces while commissioning operas about it. On paper, it looks like a masterstroke. In reality, it's the beginning of two slowly diverging dynastic train wrecks, running in opposite directions but powered by the same bad wiring. And at the center of it all, a portrait of Charles V hangs in a hallway, looking like he knows exactly what he did. Spain's Royal House of Eternal Cousins. Welcome to the Spanish Habsburgs, the premium edition of dynastic recursion. Here, the motto isn't just God, Gold, and Glory. It's God, Gold, Glory, and please don't marry outside the family. If you thought the Austrian side was excessive, wait until you meet Spain's most majestic export, concentrated genetic commitment. Philip II, the first solo act of the Spanish Habsburg line, is determined to take Catholicism and consanguinity to their final operatic conclusions. His reign is like a candlelit sermon soaked in incense and regret. He builds the Escorial, part monastery, part palace, part architectural cry for help, and fills it with art, relics, and blood relations. His marital resume: 4 wives. 3 were cousins. 1 was Mary Thirst of England, also known as Bloody Mary, who spent most of their brief marriage either executing Protestants or praying Philip would stop glancing at her sister. Spoiler, he didn't. Romance. And then it gets worse. By the time we hit Philip III, the Habsburg gene pool is looking less like a pool and more like a warm bird bath. The royal children start showing signs of what one might gently call hereditary turbulence. The facial features begin to wobble, the jaws thicken, the legs grow bowed, the medical bills go up. Now enter Philip IV, a man who fathers dozens of children, only a handful of whom survive, and commissions more portraits of himself than possibly any monarch in history, mostly to reassure the public that he still had a functioning face. Spoiler again, he sort of didn't. Every child is born with more titles than chromosomes. The family is now so tightly woven that even the priests are starting to raise their eyebrows during betrothals. At one point, someone proposes a marriage between an uncle and his niece, and the court just kind of shrugs. At least they're not siblings, says the bishop. As the generations pass, Spanish politics slow to a slurred crawl. Court intrigue turns into court paranoia. Every ambassador complains about the smell. The king develops mysterious illnesses that turn out to be dietary scurvy from refusing to eat vegetables. The queens grow quieter. The advisors grow older. The cousins grow inward. Eventually, the Habsburgs in Spain become more symbol than sovereign. They sit in embroidered silence, surrounded by saints' bones and unlabeled jars of mercury. they are still kings. But their power is spectral, a lingering echo of conquest, faith, and at one time they married the same woman twice across generations. And this whole time, the Austrian branch watches, horrified but intrigued. Like looking into a slightly more distorted mirror and realizing, oh no, that's us in 20 years. The Austrian branch. Melancholy, majesty, and marrying your niece, again. Ah, Austria. Land of alpine splendor, sad composers, and Habsburgs who prefer their politics laced with lace, incense, and a quiet sense of doom. While the Spanish branch spirals into devotional chaos and jaw-related obscurity, the Austrian Habsburgs carry the torch with a kind of melancholic grandeur. Think opera, but performed entirely by people who've married each other's nieces. Let's talk Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor, militant Catholic, and a man whose facial hair looks like it's trying to flee his face. He kicks off the 30 Years' War, one of Europe's bloodiest, most inexplicable conflicts, largely because he couldn't handle the idea of Protestants existing within whispering distance of his throne. He spends much of his reign purging Bohemia, enforcing Catholicism, and wearing robes that make him look like an undercooked lasagna. Then there's Leopold I, who reigns for nearly 50 years, looks like he was carved from tired wax, and marries not one, but two nieces. His jaw is an architectural feature. His portraits show him in enormous wigs, standing awkwardly in rooms so baroque they trigger vertigo. His hobbies include harpsichord music, poor decision-making, and filling the court with advisors who are also cousins. Under Leopold, the Austrian court becomes a place where everything is ceremonial, nothing is spontaneous, and most diplomatic discussions are conducted through the rustling of starched collars. Foreign visitors comment on the silence, on the dust, on the smell of decaying velvet and mild incest. One ambassador refers to the court as a cathedral where the statues have started blinking. The family line, of course, is still folding in on itself like cursed laundry. Marriage alliances are drawn up by clerics, lawyers, and cryptographers. The goal is simple: keep the empire intact by keeping the gene pool familiar. Familiar to the point of unsettling. Enter Maria Anna of Austria, who marries her uncle Philip IV of Spain, yes, that Philip IV, thereby uniting two aggressively inbred branches in what could only be described as a biological challenge to God. Their son, Charles II, will inherit all of Spain's misfortune and Austria's bone structure. But that's a tragedy for another part. At this point, the Austrian Habsburgs have refined the art of looking powerful while quietly unraveling. They still commission grand architecture. They still host endless balls. They still wear sashes that weigh more than their leg bones, but their policies are increasingly reactive, their generals are increasingly confused, and their chins are increasingly perpendicular to their faces. Still, they endure. Because the Austrian Habsburgs understand something essential. You don't need to be healthy, loved, or genetically sound. You just need to keep the illusion going, keep the masses impressed, keep the succession clear. And if your children can't walk in a straight line or pronounce their own names, that's what governesses and Latin tutors are for. The Austrian branch. Melancholy, majesty, and marrying your niece, again. Ah, Austria. Land of alpine splendor, sad composers, and Habsburgs who prefer their politics laced with lace, incense, and a quiet sense of doom. While the Spanish branch spirals into devotional chaos and jaw-related obscurity, the Austrian Habsburgs carry the torch with a kind of melancholic grandeur. Think opera, but performed entirely by people who've married each other's nieces. Let's talk Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor, militant Catholic, and a man whose facial hair looks like it's trying to flee his face. He kicks off the 30 Years' War, one of Europe's bloodiest, most inexplicable conflicts, largely because he couldn't handle the idea of Protestants existing within whispering distance of his throne. He spends much of his reign purging Bohemia, enforcing Catholicism, and wearing robes that make him look like an undercooked lasagna. Then there's Leopold I, who reigns for nearly 50 years, looks like he was carved from tired wax, and marries not one, but two nieces. His jaw is an architectural feature. His portraits show him in enormous wigs, standing awkwardly in rooms so baroque they trigger vertigo. His hobbies include harpsichord music, poor decision-making, and filling the court with advisors who are also cousins. Under Leopold, the Austrian court becomes a place where everything is ceremonial, nothing is spontaneous, and most diplomatic discussions are conducted through the rustling of starched collars. Foreign visitors comment on the silence, on the dust, on the smell of decaying velvet and mild incest. One ambassador refers to the court as a cathedral where the statues have started blinking. The family line, of course, is still folding in on itself like cursed laundry. Marriage alliances are drawn up by clerics, lawyers, and cryptographers. The goal is simple: keep the empire intact by keeping the gene pool familiar to the point of unsettling. Enter Maria Anna of Austria, who marries her uncle Philip IV of Spain, yes, that Philip Thorg, thereby uniting two aggressively inbred branches in what could only be described as a biological challenge to God. Their son, Charles II, will inherit all of Spain's misfortune and Austria's bone structure. But that's a tragedy for another part. At this point, the Austrian Habsburgs have refined the art of looking powerful while quietly unraveling. They still commission grand architecture. They still host endless balls. They still wear sashes that weigh more than their leg bones. But their policies are increasingly reactive. Their generals are increasingly confused, and their chins are increasingly perpendicular to their faces. Still, they endure. Because the Austrian Habsburgs understand something essential. You don't need to be healthy, loved, or genetically sound. You just need to keep the illusion going. Keep the masses impressed. Keep the succession clear. And if your children can't walk in a straight line or pronounce their own names, that's what governesses and Latin tutors are for. The double funeral and the triple chin. Endgame in velvet. It all ends, as these stories often do, with a funeral. Two, actually, one for an empire, one for a jaw. The Spanish Habsburg line, once masters of oceans, gold, and absurdly decorative chins, dies out in 1700 with Charles II, the last of his line, and a man so medically cursed he was practically a walking eulogy. Charles II was not just sickly. He was a compilation of recessive traits held together by royal inertia. He had trouble speaking, chewing, walking, and most importantly, producing heirs. His autopsy revealed a body that read like a punchline, a heart the size of a walnut, a head full of fluid, and intestines that appeared to have staged a mutiny years before. His death was not unexpected. What was unexpected was the resulting war, the War of Spanish Succession, which dragged Europe into yet another multi-decade bout of territorial fist-fighting over who got the cursed inheritance. Austria, of course, put forward their own Habsburg candidate, because nothing says solve the inbreeding crisis like offering up a cousin from the same gene puddle. Meanwhile, in Austria, the dynasty continues. But the tone has changed. The velvet is heavier, the court music slower, the portraits more somber, as if everyone's aware the family magic is thinning. Even the wigs start getting smaller, as if to say, we're tired too. The Habsburgs will limp on for another century and a half, eventually transforming into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a title so ornate it distracts from the fact that they're losing relevance one musty curtain at a time. They host balls, they wear medals, they write letters in 6 languages and marry nieces in 3. But the spark is gone, the grandeur is fading, the triple chins remain. And so the Habsburg saga concludes, not with a bang, but with a prolonged sigh in Latin. They ruled the known world, and then became a cautionary tale embroidered in gold. Their faces, immortalized in oil, live on in museums, textbooks, and memes. Their empire, gone. Their dynasty, extinct. But the jaw is eternal. Chapter 5. Charles II of Spain, a case study in genetic ambition, born to rule, and also to concern every physician in Europe. Charles II of Spain wasn't born. He was unleashed onto a world wholly unprepared for the full consequences of Habsburg strategic matchmaking. He is what happens when you take several centuries of royal inbreeding, concentrate it into one human being, and then hand that human being an empire, a crown, and a ceremonial scepter he can barely hold without assistance. From the moment of his birth in 1661, things were ominous. He didn't cry much, or move much, or blink evenly. His fontanelle, the soft spot in a baby's skull, stayed open until well past toddlerhood. He didn't learn to walk until he was 4, speak until he was 8, or inspire confidence until never. The royal court did its best to pretend everything was fine. Charles was merely delicate, they said, sensitive. But behind closed doors, the doctors knew. This child was a collection of symptoms wearing a velvet bib. His mouth could not close. His jaw jutted out like it was trying to escape the rest of his face. His tongue was too large. His digestion was performatively bad. And yet, because he was a Habsburg, the plan was clear. Crown him, marry him off, and produce heirs. Simple. There were a few problems with this. First, Charles had the mental development of a child well into adulthood. He spoke with difficulty, if at all. He drooled. He was easily frightened by loud noises and mirrors. Second, he suffered from a vast and creatively devastating array of health issues. One leg shorter than the other, chronic fevers, seizures, periodic blindness. And he was often bedridden with undiagnosed nervous conditions that sounded suspiciously like being unable to sit upright without seeing saints. But the dynasty needed continuity. So Charles was propped up in court, painted in full armor, and paraded through royal ceremonies while the nobles silently tried to calculate how many more years the empire could last on sheer denial. He was married off twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, who reportedly cried daily and died young, possibly from stress, possibly from poison, possibly just from being married to Charles. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen for her robust German fertility. She produced 0 heirs and many complaints. Charles, meanwhile, spent much of his reign under the control of advisors, priests, mystics, and exorcists. At one point, a formal investigation was launched to determine whether he was literally cursed. Spoiler, they concluded he was. He ruled, technically, for 35 years. But most of that was spent watching Spain's global dominance disintegrate while he shuffled around his palace muttering prayers, bleeding from the gums, and trying to chew bread like a man negotiating with his teeth. When he died in 1700, the autopsy was brutal. His body was described as shriveled, malformed, and decayed. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotted, and his skull filled with fluid. He had no children, no strength, no legacy, except as the final punctuation mark in the Spanish Habsburg sentence. And yet, Charles II wasn't a villain. He was a victim. A very confused, very ill, tragically symbolic victim of an empire that believed bloodlines were more sacred than biology. He tried, he prayed, he wanted to be a good king. But the dynasty had written a check his genes couldn't cash. He was born to rule, and also to be a walking medical dissertation. The Bewitched King, Exorcisms, Mysticism, and the Decline of Spain. By the time Charles II was in his 20s, the situation had gone from unfortunate to outright supernatural. His symptoms, physical, mental, and emotional, were no longer just whispered about in court. They were discussed openly, documented in diplomatic letters, and eventually blamed on witchcraft. That's right. In the age of empires and enlightenment, Spain's political strategy was downgraded to, maybe the devil did it. It didn't help that Charles himself believed it. He was terrified of mirrors. He recoiled from shadows. He insisted on sleeping surrounded by holy relics, rosaries, saints' bones, and enough candlelight to be visible from Mars. He consulted astrologers, monks, and a revolving door of exorcists, each of whom claimed they could banish the dark spirits afflicting him. What they actually did was reinforce the idea that Spain, once the global symbol of imperial might, was now being ruled by a man who couldn't chew and thought ghosts were stealing his stamina. The term El Hechizado, the Bewitched, became his unofficial royal nickname. Not the Great, not the Wise, not even the Brief. Just the Bewitched. Foreign ambassadors, writing in coded reports to avoid insulting the Spanish court directly, described him with phrases like unfit for governance, perpetually vacant, and an anatomy best left to science. His court was a disaster. Factions of scheming nobles clashed over control of policy while Charles sat silently in the middle, blinking slowly and trying to remember if he was supposed to sign something or pray over it. His ministers used him like a wax seal, ceremonially important, physically fragile, and utterly incapable of resisting whatever paper they pressed him onto. Meanwhile, Spain itself was unraveling. The economy had collapsed under centuries of war and mismanagement. The colonies were draining resources faster than they brought wealth. Inflation was out of control, the military was crumbling, but all anyone in the palace wanted to talk about was whether Charles was possessed, hexed, or simply too Catholic to function. At one point, an exorcist was brought in who declared that Charles was being tormented by 6 demons simultaneously. 6! That's a very specific number of invisible enemies. The king was anointed, screamed over, bathed in holy water, and made to chant Latin until his jaw locked mid-blessing. The exorcisms didn't help. Neither did the potions, the fasting, or the imported reliquaries from half a dozen saints. Charles continued to decay in real time, his reign turning into a live-action tragic opera with increasingly surreal side quests. And all the while, the one thing he could not do, the one thing he needed to do, was produce an heir. The royal line was hanging by the weakest of threads, and the women he married were more likely to write letters to their confessors than conceive children. One wrote that being Charles's wife was like tending to a relic, but without the miracles. Eventually, even the church had to admit that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a case of demonic infestation. It was the result of what happens when an entire family decides to genetically cannonball into the same gene pool for 200 years and hope prayer compensates for biology. By the time Charles died in 1700, Spain was spiritually exhausted. His death wasn't just the end of a reign. It was the ghostly exhalation of an empire trying to pretend it hadn't spent 3 decades ruled by a man who thought blinking was a strategic action. The bewitched king left behind no heirs, no successors, and no illusions about the state of the Spanish Habsburgs. Just a will. and a war. The will that started a war, succession, collapse, and the price of a jawline. Charles II had one job: produce an heir and keep the empire going. He did not. What he did leave behind, however, was a will, and in classic Habsburg fashion it was less of a resolution and more of a live grenade with a wax seal. On his deathbed, surrounded by courtiers, candles, and enough crucifixes to staff a mid-sized cathedral, Charles scrawled his final decree. He named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. A Bourbon, a Frenchman, a non-Habsburg. Cue panic. This was not just a family squabble. This was European geopolitics imploding in slow motion. Spain, once the proud jewel of the Habsburg crown, was now being handed to the French, the same French who had been threatening to gobble up Europe with baguettes, cannons, and heavy perfume. The Austrian Habsburgs were furious. They'd spent generations carefully breeding increasingly spherical heirs to inherit this exact throne. Charles's will wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a trigger, one that launched the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict so big it involved almost every major European power, and so chaotic that most people needed a family tree, a flowchart, and a stiff drink just to understand what side they were on. The Austrians put forward their own Charles of Austria, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The reasoning: we're Habsburgs, this is our thing. Also, we still technically own most of Europe's jawlines. The Bourbons countered with, he said Philip. Also, look at our wigs, they're huge. The war lasted over a decade. Spain was carved up like a roast at a very tense family dinner. Cities were besieged, alliances collapsed, economies shattered, all because a man with a liquefied brain and a collapsing chin couldn't have children and wrote a will while possibly hallucinating saints. And what of Charles's precious inheritance? Spain was ultimately given to Philip, but only after he agreed that France and Spain would never unite under one crown. Austria got bits and pieces, the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, as a consolation prize. The balance of power shifted. Europe exhaled. But it wasn't just land that changed hands. It was legitimacy. With Charles II's death and the fallout that followed, the Habsburg myth finally started to crack. They had been divine, inevitable, permanent. But now they were just another dynasty, clawing for power, scrambling for relevance, and leaving behind medical records that made future historians wince. The war didn't just mark the end of Spanish Habsburg power. It marked the beginning of modern European diplomacy, where lines on maps mattered more than bloodlines, and succession crises couldn't be solved with a cousin and a christening. And it all started with one man, one jaw, one will. Legacy of the last Habsburg, museums, memes, and the most studied skull in royal history. Charles II may have ruled poorly, married worse, and failed to sire an heir, but in one strange twist of fate, he succeeded at something else: immortality, not through legend, but through autopsy and memes. His skull, famously malformed, has been examined more times than a Renaissance saint's toe bone. Historians, pathologists, and overly enthusiastic PhD students have poked, scanned, reconstructed, and reanimated his face in CGI to understand what centuries of looped chromosomes actually did. Spoiler: nothing good. His condition is now known as a textbook case of inbreeding depression. The level of homozygosity in his genome, that's when identical genes double up like a broken photocopier, was comparable to the offspring of brother-sister unions, not cousins, not nieces, full siblings. In a time before DNA was a thing, Charles II's body essentially conducted a double-blind medical study on dynastic delusion. Today, Charles has become an icon, not of power, but of warning. His portraits hang in museums not because he was a great ruler, but because he's the final note in the Habsburgs' symphony of self-inflicted doom. He is referenced in textbooks, historical TikToks, and Reddit threads titled things like "Worst Royal Ever" and "When Your Family Tree is a Noose." He's also a meme, a jaw-dropping one, literally. And yet, there's something weirdly tragic about it all. Charles II wanted to be a good king. He prayed constantly, deferred to authority, believed in the divine order of monarchy. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't violent, he was just broken. A fragile human product of a system that valued bloodlines over well-being, myth over medicine. He didn't ruin Spain. He was just the final passenger on a royal ship that had been drifting toward rocks for centuries, smiling, drooling, and wondering why the candles kept going out. His legacy lives on, but not in palaces or titles. It lives in cautionary tales, in museum captions, in classrooms and comedy specials, and eerily accurate 3D facial reconstructions. He is what happens when politics forget people, and crowns weigh more than common sense. And his jaw? That's now in history's permanent collection. Chapter 6. The Austrian Drama Club, now with more incest. Maria Theresa and the mother of all dynastic to-do lists. If you thought the Austrian Habsburgs would go gentle into that good genealogical night, you've clearly never met Maria Theresa. One-woman dynastic bulldozer, multitasking empress, and the reason your family has 16 cousins named Joseph. She becomes ruler of the Habsburg lands in 1740, despite the small issue that she's a woman, and the even bigger issue that half of Europe immediately tries to bite off chunks of her empire like it's a meat pie at a royal picnic. But Maria doesn't blink. She just starts breeding. She has 16 children. 16. She turns her uterus into a diplomatic printing press and marries her offspring off to every available royal on the continent, like she's playing Risk with baby monitors. One daughter becomes Queen of France. Spoiler, it's Marie Antoinette. One son becomes Holy Roman Emperor. A third accidentally rules the Grand Duchy of Tuscany after someone loses a war in a spreadsheet. Maria Theresa doesn't just marry nieces and cousins, she creates them. She is the genetic keystone of the late-stage Austrian Habsburgs. Her offspring form an entire incest pyramid of alliances, all designed to keep the empire intact while quietly ignoring the fact that everyone at the next family dinner shares a great-grandparent in a forehead shape. Meanwhile, she rules like a micromanaging nun with a sword. She reforms the army. She tweaks the economy. She improves education for boys. Girls, on the other hand, are educated to be docile and fertile, which is a fancy way of saying ideal wives for their uncles. Maria's court is a strange mix of grandeur and repressed panic. Wigs are still mandatory, everyone speaks Latin with a regional accent, and every portrait painter is under strict instructions to crop the chin. Foreign diplomats note that the Viennese court feels both magnificent and medically suspicious, like Versailles if you replaced half the courtiers with first-degree relatives. But Maria doesn't care. She sees her empire like a fragile brocade cushion, beautiful, complicated, and in constant need of being sat on correctly. And if that means another niece marries her half-uncle to secure a naval port, so be it. The dynasty must survive. The dinner seating chart can suffer. Joseph II. Enlightenment, exhaustion, and emotionally repressed reform. Meet Joseph II, son of Maria Theresa, Holy Roman Emperor, certified Enlightenment nerd, and a man so tightly wound that even his wig looks anxious. If Maria was the iron-willed matriarch holding the empire together with faith and bloodlines, Joseph is the over-caffeinated philosophy major trying to turn it into a rationalist utopia before breakfast. Joseph is what happens when you raise a boy in a palace, stuff him with Voltaire, and then give him control over one of the most chaotic empires in Europe. He believes in progress, efficiency, and not marrying his cousin, which frankly is already revolutionary by Habsburg standards. His reign is a flurry of reforms, proclamations, and disappointed sighs. He abolishes serfdom. He promotes religious tolerance. He tries to streamline legal codes, hospitals, education, and tax systems, often at the exact same time, using handwritten notes delivered by a flustered assistant who has no idea what half the Latin even means. Joseph writes laws faster than anyone can read them. He's constantly frustrated that his reforms don't magically reshape society overnight. He wants to modernize everything from grain storage to monastery management. But he forgets one crucial thing. Most of his empire still thinks thunder is caused by witches. He's a micromanager with a messiah complex. He visits hospitals in disguise. He writes marginal notes on every document. He's obsessed with making cemeteries more efficient. And yet, for all his Enlightenment brilliance, he remains a product of his dynasty. Awkward in public, emotionally bottled up, and haunted by a chin that looms like a family curse. His personal life? A mess. His first wife dies young. His second marriage is loveless. His children die. His only reliable companion is his melancholy, and maybe a portrait of Rousseau that he keeps near his writing desk like an aspirational deity. The court can't keep up. Nobles complain. Clergy revolt. Peasants shrug and continue doing whatever their grandfathers did, which mostly involves not reading. Joseph grows bitter. He issues more edicts. He becomes increasingly isolated. At one point, he even tries to reform funeral customs so rigorously that people riot because their dead relatives can't be properly buried. Eventually, he dies, worn out, misunderstood, and slightly betrayed by the very people he tried to uplift. His epitaph, reportedly chosen by him, reads, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in all he undertook." It's the most Habsburg thing ever. A tragic overachiever with a reform agenda and a head shaped like a miscast bust. And yet, in a weird way, he's a modern hero. A man born into ridiculous privilege who tried, sincerely, exhaustingly, to make things better. He didn't believe in divine right. He believed in good governance. And while his reforms mostly collapsed after his death, he left behind the idea that maybe, just maybe, rulers should think more and marry their cousins less. Maximilian of Mexico, Habsburg hubris in a sombrero. If you've ever looked at a war-torn foreign country and thought, you know what would fix this? A European prince in a funny hat, congratulations, you might be Maximilian of Austria. Born in 1832, Maximilian was the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, which meant he had all the expectations of royalty with none of the actual power. So, when France, in the middle of one of its many Napoleonic hangovers, suggested he become Emperor of Mexico, Max did what any romantic, well-meaning Habsburg would do. He packed up his monogrammed trunks, got a tailor to embroider him a tropical-friendly uniform, and sailed west into what historians now call an absolutely terrible idea. On paper, the plan seemed imperial. Mexico had been through political chaos. Napoleon III wanted to expand French influence, and Maximilian, idealistic, multilingual, tragically unaware, thought he could rule with enlightened charm. He brought books, liberal reforms, and a court full of powdered Europeans who melted in the sun. The only problem? The Mexicans never really asked for him. The Republic already had a president, Benito Juarez, a highly competent indigenous leader who had no time for monarchy, especially one imported on a French gunboat. The Mexican people, understandably, were not thrilled. Maximilian, however, mistook temporary French military occupation for actual political support. So he set up shop in Chapultepec Castle and started writing imperial decrees like he was running for benevolent despot of the year. To be fair, Maximilian tried. He abolished child labor. He supported land reforms. He brought in scientists, artists, and allegedly spent hours hand-labeling botanical specimens. But his liberalism made conservatives hate him. His European accent made liberals mistrust him. And his reliance on Napoleon's troops made everyone want him gone. When the U.S. Civil War ended, America turned its full attention back to hemispheric affairs and politely told France to get out of Mexico, or else. Napoleon III, realizing this whole adventure was trending poorly on every level, yanked French support and left Maximilian holding a crown made of wishful thinking. He had a chance to escape. His wife, Carlota, who by this point had fled to Europe and suffered a spectacular mental breakdown in the Vatican, begged him to leave. His friends begged him. Even his enemies kind of hinted, "You sure about this?" But Maximilian, being a Habsburg and therefore genetically predisposed to fatal overconfidence, stayed. He said he would not abandon the Mexican people. The Mexican people, meanwhile, were preparing the firing squad. In 1867, Maximilian was captured, tried, and executed, at age 34, by the very republic he'd been sent to rule. His final words were allegedly noble. His mustache was reportedly immaculate. And his death was immortalized in a painting by Edouard Manet, because what better way to commemorate your catastrophic imperial detour than by becoming French modern art? Maximilian's story is more than just a historical footnote. It's a perfect Habsburg parable. A well-meaning aristocrat, armed with books and romantic delusions, wanders into a foreign land, ignores every red flag, and dies wearing someone else's empire. The end of the line, Franz Joseph, World War I, and the final collapse of the Habsburg world. And then silence. A long, regal exhale. Because after centuries of opulent weddings, wars, wigs, and wildly experimental genetics, the Habsburgs arrive at their final act, Emperor Franz Joseph, the reluctant caretaker of a dynasty whose best days are already oil paintings. Franz Joseph ascends in 1848, at the ripe old age of 18, just in time for revolutions, nationalist uprisings, and railways. He rules for nearly 70 years, which in Habsburg time is basically a victory lap held together with wax seals and strategic marriages. He's austere, dutiful, painfully formal. A man who shaves at 4 a.m., signs papers until nightfall, and thinks joy is a suspicious French export. But he keeps the empire ticking. Just. His life is one long series of catastrophes interrupted by brief moments of ceremonial stiffness. His brother is executed in Mexico, high again, Maximilian. His son, Crown Prince Rudolph, dies in a murder-suicide at a hunting lodge. His wife, the glamorous and deeply troubled Empress Elizabeth, is assassinated by an Italian anarchist with a nail file. And through it all, Franz Joseph rules. Not with charisma or creativity, but with the same expression he had at birth. Polite bewilderment dipped in disappointment. Then comes Franz Ferdinand, his nephew and heir, a man who dares to fall in love with a woman who isn't royal enough and gets the cold shoulder from half of Europe for it. His assassination in Sarajevo, by a 19-year-old student with a shaky plan and a pistol he barely knew how to aim, becomes the spark that ignites World War I. Franz Joseph dies in 1916, midway through the war, in a world already falling apart. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses soon after. The monarchy is dissolved, the palaces are emptied, the titles revoked. The imperial wardrobe, once a monument to ceremonial overkill, is boxed up and sent to museums. The Habsburgs flee or fade. Some become journalists, some become taxi drivers, some just become trivia. The great dynasty that once ruled half of Europe, with scrolls, marriages, and increasingly ambitious mandibles, is reduced to a footnote, a warning, a meme. And yet their echo lingers, in marble busts, in dusty corridors, in genealogical nightmares and dramatically lit Netflix documentaries. The Habsburg name lives on, not in rule, but in reminder. A dynasty that couldn't stop itself from marrying its cousins. A family that thought power was hereditary and so was health. An empire built on portraits, treaties, and denial. In the end, they didn't fall. They unraveled. And the last thread was a bullet, a war, and a jaw too heavy for its own legacy. Chapter 7. The Fall of the House of Uncomfortably Close Relations. It doesn't happen all at once. It never does. No great empire collapses on a Monday afternoon while someone's cutting the roast pheasant. The Habsburgs, bless them, unraveled the way a velvet curtain rots, slowly, decadently, and with increasing layers of dust no one wanted to acknowledge. The signs had been there for generations. The genetic decay, the fragile heirs, the exorcisms. But there was also the larger truth. The world was changing, and the Habsburgs were not. As the Enlightenment bloomed and revolutions brewed in France, America, and across the colonies, the Habsburg court doubled down on powdered wigs, ceremonial brocade, and opera plots that suspiciously resembled family reunions. They governed by decree, advised by cousins, served by servants whose jobs had job titles longer than treaties. They believed in tradition. The world believed in rifles. One by one, the edges of the empire began to fray. Nationalist movements in Hungary, Bohemia, Italy, and the Balkans rose up, asking difficult questions like, "Why are we ruled by someone who doesn't speak our language?" And, "Is it normal for our emperor's jaw to be visible from across a ballroom?" Wars became more frequent. Bureaucracy became more labyrinthine. Diplomacy became less about treaties and more about stalling. And still, the family kept marrying itself. Like a child too afraid to admit the goldfish is dead, they kept dressing it up and feeding it cousin soup. By the time World War I arrived, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was held together by paperwork, denial, and Franz Joseph's increasingly shaky signature. The heir, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a 19-year-old Serbian student who was arguably the only person in Europe who hadn't seen this coming. The war broke everything. Economies, borders, thrones. The empire collapsed not with revolution but with resignation. The people didn't storm the palaces, they just stopped showing up. And the Habsburgs, they left. Quietly, some fled. Some negotiated safe passage. Some tried to cling to their titles like a moth clinging to a tapestry being dragged into the sea. No last stand, no climactic sword fight, just the end of a very long, very awkward dinner party. And so the House of Habsburg, once the most powerful family in Europe, passed into history. It died as it had lived, surrounded by cousins and slightly out of breath. Chapter 8. What Your Jawline Says About Global Politics. Historians love debating the causes of dynastic collapse. War, debt, disease, poor succession planning, bad maps, worse treaties. But sometimes it's the jaw. Because by the time the Habsburgs sputtered their way into the 20th century, their most recognizable feature wasn't their flag, their faith, or even their fleet of dubious cousins. It was their mandible, that famous noble cantilevered chin, projecting outward like a diplomatic threat and inherited like a cursed heirloom. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a facial feature, it was a foreign policy hazard. Think about it. Every portrait, every wax seal, every medal bore that increasingly improbable lower half of a face. Envoys stared, subjects whispered, doctors speculated, but for the ruling family the jaw was not a problem. It was a badge, a symbol of continuity, of legacy, of 400 years of cousin-wrangling imperialism. Until it wasn't. As Europe modernized, monarchs were expected to be visible. Newspapers printed photos. Television loomed. Speeches became standard. And suddenly, having a jaw that required its own support staff wasn't a quirk. It was a liability. When your empire is known as the one where the emperor drools during the anthem, you're in trouble. Even the simplest diplomatic events were strained. Banquet to welcome the Dutch? The emperor can't chew the duck. Peace talks in Prague? He needs a silver spittoon just to finish a sentence. Marriage proposal? Please include a dental x-ray with the dowry agreement. The Habsburgs had become victims of their own symbolic architecture. They had spent centuries proving their continuity by repeating the same face, the same names, the same mistakes. And now, the world had caught up, and was wondering why one of the most powerful families in Europe couldn't form a full consonant. That jaw had been sculpted into medals, chiseled into statues, stamped into coins. It had become the brand. But unlike a national flag, it couldn't be replaced. You couldn't rebrand your bone structure. You couldn't quietly modernize the chin. The Habsburgs were stuck, genetically and diplomatically. Their jawline became a metaphor for stubbornness, for refusal to adapt, for continuity without innovation. And so, while their empire crumbled under the weight of revolution and artillery, their final portraits still hung in gilt frames, stoic, expressionless, and jaw first into history. Chapter 9. You ruled half of Europe. You couldn't chew soup. So, still want to be a Habsburg? You'll get palaces, portraits, powdered wigs, and more land than you can govern without triggering 12 minor wars and a papal footnote. You'll dine beneath chandeliers, ride in gold-plated carriages, and have your name sung in Latin by choirs paid to pretend they like you. But you'll also get cousins. Lots of them. Some of them twice. You'll get arranged marriages with people who share your jaw, your blood, and your likelihood of producing a child shaped like a family crest. You'll get advisors who are also relatives, enemies who are also relatives, and ulcers that probably have titles. You'll be expected to lead, inspire, expand, and reproduce, all while your immune system files daily complaints to the Pope. You'll reign through revolts, plagues, and very dramatic parades. You'll wear more velvet than any sane person should. You'll sleep beneath murals of your great-grandfather's battle victories and wake up to find your empire 5% smaller. And when the portraits are painted, as they will be, endlessly, you'll sit very still while someone tries to hide the chin, soften the jaw, and pretend your profile doesn't look like a misplaced buttress from a Gothic cathedral. Because the truth is, you ruled half of Europe, and you couldn't chew soup. That's the Habsburg legacy. Glory, grandeur, and a jawline that history will never forget. A family that conquered the world and then folded in on itself, one cousin at a time. Rest in peace, noble archdukes and duchesses. May your portraits be flattering, and your descendants be slightly more genetically diversified.